My twin brother stole my identity and ruined my life, so I stole his and made it better. Growing up as an identical twin in suburban Ohio was like living in a constant state of mistaken identity, but I never thought it would escalate to the point where my own brother would literally steal my life. We looked exactly the same, down to the small scar above our left eyebrow from when we both fell off our bikes at age 7, but our personalities couldn't have been more different. I was always the responsible one, the one who did homework on time, helped mom with groceries, and saved up every penny from my part-time job at the local grocery store. My brother was the charmer, the one who could talk his way out of any situation, get girls to fall for him with just a smile, and somehow always landed on his feet no matter how badly he screwed up. The first sign of trouble came when I was 22 and applied for my first apartment after college. I had saved up enough for a deposit and first month's rent, had a steady income, and my credit score was decent for someone my age. But when the landlord ran my background check, he called me back with confusion in his voice, telling me there were some serious red flags on my record. Apparently, someone with my social security number had defaulted on multiple credit cards, had an eviction notice from 2 years prior, and had even been arrested for public intoxication in a city I'd never even visited. The landlord was apologetic but firm. There was no way he could rent to someone with my record. I spent the next 3 weeks living in a motel room, using every spare moment to figure out what had happened to my credit and my reputation. The paper trail led me to a series of applications and accounts that had been opened in my name, all with addresses I'd never lived at, but all bearing my social security number and personal information. The worst part was when I called my brother to vent about the situation, and he seemed unusually quiet, almost nervous. He kept asking specific questions about what I'd found, what the investigators had told me, and whether I had any idea who might have done this to me. It took me another month to piece together the truth, and when I did, it felt like someone had punched me in the gut and left me gasping for air. My brother had been using my identity for nearly 4 years, opening accounts, signing leases, and basically living a second life under my name whenever his own reputation got too damaged to be useful. The confrontation happened at our parents' house during Sunday dinner, and I'll never forget the look on his face when I laid out all the evidence in front of him. Instead of denying it or showing any remorse, he actually had the audacity to get angry at me for investigating, claiming that I was being dramatic and that he'd always planned to pay everything back eventually. Our parents were devastated, caught between their two sons, and I could see the pain in their eyes as they tried to process what their golden child had done to their reliable one. My mother cried for 3 straight days, and my father barely spoke to either of us for weeks. The legal process to clear my name was a nightmare that took over a year and cost me thousands of dollars in legal fees. I had to file police reports, dispute dozens of fraudulent accounts, and provide documentation proving that I wasn't responsible for debts that had been accumulating in my name for years. Meanwhile, my brother seemed to think that a simple apology would fix everything, and when I refused to just let it go, he started telling people that I was being unreasonable and holding a grudge. He painted himself as the victim, claiming that he'd made some mistakes but that I was being cruel by involving the authorities. The worst part was watching how easily he moved on with his life, while I was stuck dealing with the consequences of his actions. He got a new place, started dating someone new, and seemed completely unbothered by the chaos he'd created in my life. I spent 2 years rebuilding my credit, finding apartments that would accept me despite my damaged history, and trying to move forward. But something inside me had changed during those 2 years. Something that made me realize that being the good guy hadn't protected me from getting screwed over by the person I should have been able to trust most. The turning point came when I discovered that my brother had been bragging to his friends about how he'd gotten away with identity theft, claiming that family loyalty meant I'd never actually press charges or follow through with serious consequences. He'd been telling people that I was too much of a pushover to really make him pay for what he'd done. That's when I started paying attention to his life in a way I never had before, and I realized that his entire existence was built on lies, manipulation, and taking advantage of people who cared about him. He'd been fired from 3 different positions for stealing from employers, had cheated on every girlfriend he'd ever had, and owed money to half the people in our hometown. But here's the thing about my brother: despite all his flaws and terrible choices, he was genuinely talented at presenting himself as successful and trustworthy. He had this way of walking into a room and making people believe he was exactly what they were looking for, whether it was a potential employer, a romantic partner, or just someone to befriend. I started studying him like a scientist studying a specimen, learning his mannerisms, his speech patterns, the way he held himself, and the specific lies he told to different people. Since we were identical twins, I had the perfect foundation to become him. But I wanted to become the version of him that actually followed through on promises and treated people with respect. The first time I impersonated him was at a networking event in the next city over, where I knew he was supposed to meet with some potential business partners. I showed up instead, using his name and his charm, but actually listening to what people needed and offering real solutions instead of empty promises. The meeting went incredibly well, and I walked away with 3 solid business contacts and a clear understanding of how powerful his persona could be when backed up with actual integrity and follow-through. These people had been expecting to meet my brother, but they got a version of him that actually delivered on commitments and treated them with respect. I started small, taking over some of his social media accounts and cleaning up his online presence, removing offensive posts and replacing them with more professional content. I began responding to messages from people he'd ghosted, offering genuine apologies and making good on promises he'd broken. The transformation was gradual but dramatic, and within 6 months, people started commenting on how much my brother had changed, how he'd become more reliable and considerate. His reputation began to improve, and opportunities started coming his way that he'd never had access to before. Meanwhile, I was careful to maintain my own identity and life, but I found myself spending more and more time living as the better version of him. I was fixing relationships he'd damaged, pursuing opportunities he'd wasted, and generally building the life he could have had if he'd made better choices. The real breakthrough came when I got a call from a company that wanted to hire him for a position he'd applied for months earlier but never followed up on. I took the meeting, aced the interview, and got the offer, all while pretending to be him. The job was everything I'd wanted for myself, challenging and rewarding with great benefits and growth potential. I was living his life, but I was living it better than he ever had, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. Of course, the situation couldn't last forever, and I knew that eventually, I'd have to figure out how to transition from impersonating him to actually taking over his identity completely. The opportunity came when he got arrested for drunk driving and spent 3 days in jail, giving me a window to make some permanent changes. I used those 3 days to consolidate his accounts, change passwords, and redirect his mail to an address I controlled. I also reached out to everyone in his network, explaining that he was going through a difficult time and that I'd be handling his affairs temporarily. When he got out of jail, he found that his entire digital life had been taken over, and just like I'd experienced years earlier, he was locked out of accounts and unable to access his own identity. The difference was that I was using his identity to build something positive, while he'd used mine to destroy my reputation. The confrontation this time was different, partly because he was already in a vulnerable state from his arrest, but mostly because I'd learned from watching him how to be persuasive and confident. I explained to him that I was simply returning the favor, that he'd shown me how easy it was to take over someone's life, and that I was just applying the same techniques. He threatened to call the police, but I pointed out that doing so would require him to admit to his original identity theft, which would likely result in serious criminal charges. He threatened to tell our parents, but I reminded him that they were already disappointed in him and might actually be relieved to see his life finally heading in a positive direction. The beauty of the situation was that everyone preferred the version of him that I was creating, from his friends to his former employers to even his ex-girlfriends who started reaching out to reconnect with the new and improved version of him they'd been hearing about. I spent the next year fully living as him, taking his name, his relationships, and his opportunities, but making them all better than they'd ever been. I was more successful at his job than he'd ever been at any of his positions. I treated his friends with more respect than he'd ever shown them, and I generally became the person he could have been if he'd made better choices. The most satisfying part was watching how differently people responded to him when he was actually reliable and trustworthy, when he followed through on commitments and treated others with consideration. His reputation improved dramatically, and opportunities started flowing in ways he'd never experienced. Meanwhile, my brother was forced to start over completely, building a new identity from scratch and learning what it felt like to have no credit, no reputation, and no network of people willing to vouch for him. He had to get a job using his middle name and social security number, finding places to live that would accept someone with no rental history, and basically experiencing all the challenges I'd faced when he destroyed my credit and reputation. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was now living the life I'd been forced to rebuild, while I was enjoying the life he'd always taken for granted. He was working entry-level positions and living in cheap apartments, while I was climbing the corporate ladder and living in a nice place in a good neighborhood. Our parents eventually figured out what had happened, but by then, the results spoke for themselves. The son they'd always worried about was finally stable and successful, while the son they'd always trusted was struggling to get his life together. They were conflicted about the situation, understanding that what I'd done was technically wrong, but also seeing that the outcome had been positive for everyone involved. My brother was finally learning to be responsible and self-reliant, while I was thriving in ways I'd never been able to before. The strangest part of the whole experience was how natural it felt to be him, how easy it was to slip into his skin and live his life better than he'd ever lived it. I realized that the main difference between us wasn't our capabilities or our potential, but our choices and our values. I'd always been constrained by my need to be perfect, to never make mistakes, to always do the right thing, while he'd been held back by his selfishness and inability to consider the consequences of his actions. Living as him gave me permission to be more confident and assertive, while forcing him to be more responsible and considerate. 2 years later, we're both living completely different lives than we were before this all started, and in some ways, we're both better off. He's learned to work for what he wants and to treat people with respect, while I've learned to stand up for myself and to pursue opportunities aggressively. We don't talk much anymore, but when we do, there's a strange kind of understanding between us. He knows that I could destroy his new life just as easily as he destroyed my old one, and I know that he's finally learning what it means to build something from nothing. The funniest part is that people who knew both of us before often comment on how much we've both changed, how I've become more confident and assertive while he's become more humble and hardworking. They have no idea that we essentially traded places, that I'm living the life he threw away while he's building the life I was forced to abandon. I still sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd just taken the high road, if I'd simply focused on rebuilding my own life and let him deal with the consequences of his actions. But then I remember the years of struggling with damaged credit, the apartments I couldn't get, the opportunities I lost, and the way he laughed about getting away with ruining my life. The truth is, I don't regret what I did, and I don't feel guilty about the way things turned out. He taught me that being nice doesn't protect you from people who are willing to take advantage of your kindness, and that sometimes the only way to get justice is to take it yourself. I'm living proof that his life could have been amazing if he'd just made better choices, and he's living proof that starting over is possible even when you've burned every bridge and destroyed every relationship. We're both different people than we were 5 years ago, and in some weird way, we're both better off. The identity theft that started this whole mess taught me that who you are isn't just about your name or your social security number. It's about your choices and your actions. My brother stole my identity, but I stole his life and made it into something worth having. Now when I look in the mirror, I see someone who's learned to fight for what he wants, who's not afraid to take risks, and who understands that sometimes you have to be willing to cross lines to get the life you deserve. I'm still the same person I always was, but I'm also the person I needed to become to survive what he put me through. The best part is that everyone who knew him before is genuinely happy about the changes they've seen, and everyone who knows me now respects the man I've become. I'm living his life, but I'm living it as the best version of myself, and that's something he could never take away from me, no matter what he tries to do in the future.